Thank you all for coming here tonight. I want to welcome all of you to Luxembourg School of Business. Of course, I see a lot of students, a lot of familiar faces, but also a lot of friends of the school.
Thank you, Marine, for the introduction. You know, there's no direct flight from Singapore to Luxembourg. So my wife and I transited through Amsterdam. So we entered Schengen in Amsterdam. And I think we were in the wrong queue because there were a number of Africans in front of us. And the immigration officer gave special attention to the passports. And for the first time, I saw an immigration officer with a jeweler's eyeglass, to scrutinize. It took forever. But luckily, a separate queue was open. So when it came to my turn, the immigration officer asked, where are you going? I said, I'm going to Luxembourg. And for what purpose? I said, well, to give a lecture. You're a professor. I'm not a professor, but I said, yes, just to keep the answer simple. Then they asked, what are you lecturing? I said, geopolitics. And they said, yeah, I would like to listen to your lecture. That surprised me. The immigration officer in Amsterdam wanted to listen to a lecture on geopolitics. So I kind of mulled over this. You see, we are now in the period of world history where everyone is a little afraid. What's going to happen next? When you wake up in the morning, Israel has bombed Qatar, something may happen in Ukraine, something may happen somewhere else. The US may invade Venezuela, who knows? And in every boardroom, geopolitics has become the single most important risk factor. How do we make sense of the world today? We are not in the business of crystal ball gazing, but we know where the world is today. And 10 years from now, we have a sense of what the world will be like 10 years from now. In between, it's impossible to predict what will happen precisely, because if you could, you'd be very wealthy. But you have a sense of the direction. So what will the world be like, say, 10 years from now? Well, for sure it'll be a multipolar world. Will the trial of strength between the US and China end by then? I doubt it. Would there be a peace agreement on Ukraine where Europeans and Russians are happy with the outcome? I doubt it. Will there be an equilibrium in the Middle East where Israelis and Palestinians walk with linked arms to the rising sun? I doubt it. Will America continue to dominate the world the way it did in the past? I doubt it. It will be a multipolar world. Of that, we can be sure. And perhaps nothing more symbolically important than the recent summits in China, where you had Xi Jinping, Putin, and Modi holding hands. And in Beijing, where Xi Jinping marched out with Putin on one side and Kim Jong-un on the other. And further on, Tokayev and Prabowo. Why Tokayev and Prabowo? Because in 2013, when Xi Jinping announced a Belt and Road Initiative, he did it first in Astana, end of August, and then more than a month later in Jakarta. China has an old statecraft, and for them, symbolisms are very important. The parade is to awe people, right? Because the marching was perfect. It was ridiculously perfect. I was a soldier before. I had to command parades. I thought, wow, how did they do that? You can practice every day and you may still not achieve that. But somehow they were able to do it. In the Pentagon, you might have read the report, that the orders for pizza from Papa Joe and Dominic shot up 4 times because they're all watching carefully who were there and what were the new weapon systems being displayed. Why did China invest so much time and effort? Is it to intimidate the world? I think for sure Trump was an important audience for them. Because what they don't want is for the Americans to miscalculate and trigger off a war with China. They have to show some cards so that Americans would hold back. They were hoping that India would be on their side against China. But I remember meeting Jai Shankar, the foreign minister in Abu Dhabi. I asked him, will India buy the S-400? I said, the US will sanction you. He said, who buy the S-400? And if they want, let them sanction us. I had no doubts that India will calculate in its own self-interest. Perhaps there was a time when they thought, yeah, they could make use of the US against China. Then when the Ukraine war happened, the US expected India to repudiate Russia. India would never do that because Russia was a strategic partner for decades. And when after Pahalgam, they had this air war with Pakistan, where India was bloodied, and India wanted the US to support them against Pakistan. The US would not do it. Instead, Trump invited the armed forces chief to the White House for lunch, and he promised to nominate Trump for the Nobel Prize. India, it's an adult relationship between India and the US. And when Modi went to Tianjin for the SCO meeting, it was partly to signal to the Americans, we will calculate in our own self-interest. China has been very careful to keep its relationship with India as much on an even keel as possible, because it is not in China's interest to have the rest of the world gang up against it. In a sense, it's been fortunate because the Ukraine war, the Middle East, these are distant conflicts. So the Chinese approach is don't get too involved. Don't be a troublemaker, be a peacemaker. But it's not a bad thing for American and Western attention to be diverted away from China. I think Europe is in a very difficult situation because European leaders were charging ahead with the US up front. And suddenly the US turned around and said, I'll be mediator. And they were still charging. And they're still charging today. And the Americans have decided that, hey, you should make peace with Russia. I think this leadership crisis in Europe will continue for a period of time. But at the end of it, Europe must find its own center of gravity and act in its own self-interest. It will always have a strong relationship with America for historical and civilizational reasons. But Europe has its own interests vis-a-vis Russia, in the Middle East, and in Africa. To me, what is most worrying for Europe is high energy prices. Because energy efficiency and availability undergirds all economic activities. In fact, it undergirds all biological life and is a key driver of evolution. If you have excess energy, whether because you can eat more, you can eat somebody else to acquire energy from that person or animal, then you can reproduce and you can defend yourself. And once you move into AI, the limiting factor will be energy, because all coding requires energy to reverse entropy. And if you have high energy prices, you'll be in trouble sooner or later. I mean, Libya was going to be a major provider of energy to Europe. It's got enormous oil and gas resources. I always suspected that Americans did not want that. The Chinese were major investors in Libya. Today, Libya is a basket case. Russia supplied cheap energy to Europe. Well, today, that's past. America is now a supplier of energy to Europe, and Europe pays a premium for it. I don't believe this will continue for too long because European industry is being undermined. So if we look further ahead, Europe cannot depend upon Trump striking a deal with Putin. And even if Xi Jinping were cooperative, there will be no deal because in the end, the deal must be between Europe and Russia. And it has to be based upon a knowledge of history. Because Russia is not going to disappear, Poland is not going to disappear. The Baltic states, the Balkans, will always be uneasily at the junction of where major tectonic plates meet. So if we cast our minds ahead, the world will be multipolar. It will not be a stable equilibrium, it will be a dynamic equilibrium. Some of you might have read the famous Chinese science fiction, The Three-Body Problem. That if there are three suns circulating around each other, the mathematics is almost impossible to solve. And if you're a planet in that system, your days and nights are completely unpredictable. And that is at the heart of the science fiction. In a multipolar world, there will be many suns or big planets circulating one against the other. So the dynamics will be complicated. And I think that's the reason why the immigration officer in Amsterdam wanted to listen to a lecture on geopolitics because instinctively people feel the world is out of joint. And they're not quite sure how to react. Where do I live? Where do I go to school? How do I diversify my assets? What languages do I want my children to study? In earlier periods of history, every time you had a kaleidoscopic change in global politics, the future is often to be found in the interstitial spaces. So during the medieval period, you had the free cities, like the cities at Hansa, which till today are still called the free and Hanseatic city of Bergen or Lübeck or Hamburg. Into those cities flowed money and talent wanting freedom. Now, in some ways, what we achieved in Singapore foreshadowed the Asia that we see today. The cities of China, Southeast Asia, and India, they've all studied Singapore for our successes and mistakes, more than we ourselves realize. In Europe, after the war, the Benelux countries played a major role. If we look into the future, maybe the smaller countries, in their discomfort with the current equilibrium and wanting to find pathways for themselves, in them we may find ideas for the future. You know, Orban is kind of cancelled in Europe, but I like him, and I'm going to Hungary. And I just read the speech he gave recently where he said, Western Europe will be in trouble, the future of Europe will be in Central Europe. Now after Luxembourg, I'm going to Prague, I'm going to Budapest, I'm going to Croatia. And I find these very interesting countries because they're not big enough, they are not former imperial powers who still, when they go to Asia, the instinct is to observe, judge, and lecture. You have all these very bright economists, journalists, especially from British and American newspapers. They will go to Asia, they will spend a month, interview people, and then they write a long piece with a prescription to each and every one of us as to how we should govern our country, and then we'll be more prosperous, we'll be happier. No, they will interview me, and I ask myself, if it was so simple, how is it in your own countries the problems remain? Because politics is a complicated matter. Their instinct is to immediately see us through a Western template, whether it's through a template of democracy versus autarky, or the Thucydidean trap, and say, this is what's going to happen to you. This is your future. They will be wrong. Because to understand, you must first understand history and culture. No society can change its nature overnight. Because every day, how we treat one another, our presumptions, they have to be replicated every day, because otherwise life is not possible. When the Europeans went to Australia, and they saw how primitive the Aborigines were, they thought the best way is to take the children from their parents, educate them in modern schools, and pole-vault them into the modern world. The outcome was completely different from what they anticipated. I still can't forget what I saw in Western Australia, in Pilbara, where you have the largest iron deposit in the world. The sun was setting, and I saw all these Aboriginal people gathering in the open field. So I asked my host, what are they doing? He said, they're gathering now, they will drink alcohol into the night till they're piss drunk. They do that every day? He said, yes. You cannot take a people, cut them off at the knees, and transplant them as you would marcot a plant. It's not possible. The same thing with the Aboriginal people in North America, where the incidence of drug addiction and alcoholism remains very high. Begin with where people are, and from within themselves, help them. And to me, the best example is what the Jesuits did when they went to China. Many of you will be familiar with Matthew Ricci. Ignatius Loyola, he was a cripple because of war, but he wanted to convert China. So he said, who would do so? And Francis Xavier put up his hand. The audacity, So he went to Japan. In the end, he died in the Pearl River Delta and never really set foot on mainland China. But when the Italian Matteo Ricci went to China, he thought, the Chinese would respect monks the way Europeans did. So he dressed as a Buddhist monk. And they scorned him because the Chinese look down on monks. He said, but they look up to scholarship. And Matteo Ricci had an encyclopedic mind and a photographic memory. So he learned the Chinese language. Recently, I attended a lecture from a priest and a professor from Boston College, a Jesuit institution, where they have archives of Matteo Ricci's handwriting. He learned calligraphy. He developed his own phonetics to study Chinese. And he impressed the Chinese by scholarship. And one of the most difficult things to do was to translate Deus into Chinese. Because the Chinese did not have a European conception of God. They have a conception of heaven. The emperor was the son of heaven, Tianzi. The world was below heaven, Tianxia. And the legitimacy to rule is Tianming, the mandate of heaven. So he translated Deus into Tianzu, the Lord of heaven. In other words, not to interfere with secular political matters. That's for the emperor. But what is above the emperor? Until today, the translation of the Catholic religion in Chinese is 天主教, the religion of the Lord of heaven. The catechism books of that period, they all had Jesus, Mary, Joseph, the apostles, Moses, Abraham as Chinese people. Because you cannot persuade highly intelligent people that their gods are foreign. They have to be off themselves. And little by little, they indigenize the Catholic religion in China. But of course they failed. The Vatican is still trying. It's an old civilization. It's like millions of lines in the operating system. You can't just alter one part and expect it to function. You can't do to the Chinese what the British did to the Aborigines or the Americans did to the American Indians. You can't do that. So when Xi Jinping said, Christianity must be cynicized, the Western view is cynical. Oh, it's trying to corrupt the Catholic religion. No. What he's saying is, for it to take root, it must emerge from their very being. So when we talk about a multipolar world, whether we're talking about India or Brazil or Africa or China or Russia, first understand their history, their intellectual and philosophical underpinnings. And if you seek to change them, assuming you have right on your side, work from within themselves. And first be prepared to also learn from them. Because if you don't learn from them, you can't teach them. I mean, as teachers, we know, if we arrogate to ourselves a monopoly of knowledge, our students will lose their respect for us immediately. They've already Googled, they've already somehow have a sense of the subject. If you see a doctor and he dismisses what you say, which you've found out from ChatGPT, you will lose respect for the doctor. He must say, oh, yes, ChatGPT says this, the books say that, but there are these considerations. Then you'll be persuaded. But if you are not prepared to learn, you cannot teach. But it takes time, it takes effort. China is a big subject. Russia is a big subject. India is a big subject. Africa is a big subject. Of course, we can master everything. But the key is attitude. There must be a humility that what I know and my perspective is limited by my own past. And someone else observing the same phenomenon might have a very different view. And once the attitude is centered in this way, communication flows and the world becomes more comprehensible and the possibilities for win-win outcomes much improved. What is worrying today is almost a refusal to understand each other. I'm very sensitive now when I'm in Europe. I mean, in East Asian circles, Singapore is S, Russia is R. So we're permanent neighbors. So I've seen Putin many times, I've seen Lavrov many times. I count Lavrov as a friend. But when I come to Europe, I'm very careful not to say that because my European friends may get angry with me. But why should they be angry with me? If you want a solution, your approach should be, you know Lavrov? Tell me about him. What animates him? What are his fears and concerns? Knowledge. I attended a peace forum in Tsinghua University. I did not see a single senior American. I asked my Chinese host. I said, did you not invite them? He said, we did, but they won't come because they were afraid of being criticized at home. Can you imagine that? How can you seek a solution if your starting point is, I do not want to talk to the other side? And if you will not talk to the other side, you will begin to demonize the other side. And then you will think of harming that other side. You demonize, you dehumanize, you work yourself into a lose-lose outcome. Whereas if we understand one another and almost be curious about the differences that separate us, that make each of us unique, then the possibilities for collaboration, for win-win outcomes becomes much greater. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. So for this, now we're going to start with I'm going to start with some questions. We will also open to the audience. I would just ask you, try to keep the thing on your chin so that we have proper sound. Let's start like this. So my first question is, when you look at the big countries, the way you would manage big countries, let's keep that aside. You have been involved and were quite instrumental in developing Singapore's foreign policy in a very interesting period of time. You were also quite close to Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern Singapore as we know it. So here we are in Luxembourg, and there's a lot of people from all over the world whose interests are in Luxembourg, in the success of this country. What can we as small countries, Singapore, Luxembourg, but I would even include any country other than the large superpowers, let's call them, how can small countries best act in this world that is shifting, that some say is going towards multipolarity, others maybe disagree, doesn't matter. So how can we protect our interests? How should we think about existing close to our larger neighbors that have interests that are not always necessarily aligned with ours?
Henry Kissinger and Lee Kuan Yew were good friends. And I think they spoke every month, right up to the final days. Kissinger was fond of, I know it goes against all my instinct for my lips to touch the microphone. Just the chin, okay. Oh, like this? Okay. All right. Okay. I'm learning. Kissinger was fond of describing Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore as being cold-blooded. He said they're so clinical in analysis, there's no emotion. If there is a genocide, if there's a war, if there are conflicts, they just analyze the forces at play. Almost no illusion about ability to change the world. You're a price taker. These are the prices. How do you respond? Because as a small country, we have to be realistic. We cannot change the world. We can't change China, we can't change Europe, we can't change America, we can't affect the relationships. We may have some agency in our own little neighborhood, maybe in ASEAN, a limited agency. That's all. First, have no inflated view of our own capabilities and be cold-blooded, be utterly realistic. So you cannot afford to have prejudices, because prejudices blind you. Which is why, whether you are from Japan or China or Europe or Africa or America, you go to Singapore, you find that, okay, it's a fair platform. People will accept you for what you are. And Luxembourg is in the same situation. People come here because they say, look, if I go to Germany or France or Britain, I'm a minority. But here, yeah, I get a fair shake. So as a small country, you cannot afford to be subjective. You have to be objective, and given the environment, ask yourself, how do I position myself? Where do I add value? How do I serve others so that I can make a living? Because no one comes to you out of charity. I mean, Singapore is quite clear. If we don't serve others, we don't eat. So the mentality is that of servicing the customer. You know, in most countries, airports are a monopoly, and so you get badly treated. You're intimidated. You have no power in the transit lounge. People can rough you up. You can be detained. They can rummage through your computer or phone, and you have no say about it. But no one has to go through Singapore. If they come to Singapore, it's because they can buy cheaper, they can sell dearer, they get lower energy prices, the bits and bytes travel faster, they get better information. So the moment you land at Changi Airport, you have a sense that it operates like a departmental store. We want footfall. We want you to come in, to spend more time. And we don't give you a sense that we're doing you a favor. That the moment you leave the airport, you feel a great sense of relief that I've cleared an obstacle course, which is the common experience in airports around the world when you have monopolies. This is the attitude small countries should always have.
Thank you. Tell me this, how do, let's say, in this case, Singaporeans, but I would say Southeast Asians in general, how do you view Europe and Europeans?
Except for Thailand, all of Southeast Asia was colonized by European powers. And their imprint remains profound, whether it's in Indonesia or Indochina or Singapore, Malaysia. But Europe today is no longer a major power in the region. Their historical memories, they are not all negative, because when the Japanese came to Southeast Asia during the war, they were so rough and brutal that local people, looking back to an earlier period of colonial rule, felt that Western colonial rule was much better than being under Japanese occupation. But the metropolitan powers arranged for people friendly to them to take over power. So Lee Kuan Yew, for instance, was supported by the British. But in some countries, there was revolution. In Indonesia, in Vietnam. So they had to fight bitter wars to achieve their independence. So their view of European powers are still colored by that. But on the whole, when they look at the world now, what concerns them most is the battle royale between the US and China. That concerns them the most. The China account is growing for everybody because China is now the biggest trading partner of every country in Southeast Asia. And people do not want China to have too much influence over them, so they seek diversification. They will want the Americans to be around. But the Americans often arm twist you to choose between them and China. And that's very unpleasant because we don't want to choose. We want to be friendly to both. The Chinese are prepared for us to be friendly to the Americans, provided we don't gang up the Americans against China. But the Americans want us to gang up with them against China, often. And that makes us uncomfortable. I tell my American friends, if you don't take that position, if you don't force a choice, then you will be welcome everywhere. Every door, every window will be open to you. But if you force a choice, you may not like the answer. But to create more room for maneuver, we want Europe, Japan, India, Australia to be present in Southeast Asia.
So tell me, we during some of our discussions in the last 2 days with people, we've noticed that several people were asking what's your take on the military parade that you already mentioned in Beijing. How should we in Europe that are now experiencing war on the continent, and which came as a surprise to many, how should we think about this prospect of potential war in Southeast Asia and the question of Taiwan? What's Singaporean view on that?
China is a huge polity. It's got a vast population. And to govern such a big country, you can't just depend on laws and regulations. You need symbols. So the governance of China have always required the management and manipulation of public symbols. So this idea of rituals involving thousands of people, and sometimes across the length and breadth of a vast country, is a necessary part of governing China. This is Confucianist philosophy. You know, if a group of Chinese take a group photograph, they know where to stand. If you are not senior, you stand on the side. You avoid the chairs. It's for senior people. And among the senior people, they've already done a mental ranking of who is the most senior. So when they exchange cards, for many in the West, it's just, it's just the information. But for the Chinese, when they exchange cards, they are doing a mental ranking of who are in the room, who are senior, who are less senior. And it affects protocol. So the idea of protocol, Li, in organizing Chinese society is very important. So when you watch a big parade in Tiananmen, it is all protocol. It is to establish a system of governance and infuse the people with a sense of pride. Then there's a foreign audience. And they need to awe their neighbors, so the neighbors will be well behaved towards China, in their view. And the Americans and the Western powers, so that they will not embark on misadventures. You see? But it's not easy if you're not from that world to understand the full meaning of that parade. I attended the same parade 10 years ago. It was not that much different from the last parade. But being ethnic Chinese, I kind of have a sense of how it's done, you know. To be invited is, of course, already a high honor. Then, where do you sit? Well, that's your place in the pantheon. What time do you have to wake up to be cleared by security? What time do you have to arrive? All that is part of an elaborate protocol. And very often when you attend an event in China, they will not tell you where you sit or stand till the last moment. Because somebody may fall sick, somebody may be absent, an additional guest may come. And like a game of Chinese checkers, suddenly everything has got to be rearranged. Then a few hours before they tell you, please stand on the second row on the left-hand side, third place from the corner or something. They will give you precise instructions. So when the photograph is taken, everything's in the right place, and everybody looking at the picture will scrutinize it carefully. Who's standing next to whom? Okay, this is a pecking order. This is Confucius. And it's upon this that an empire has been governed for many centuries.
Okay, and what about the direct potential prospect of actual war with Taiwan? How, that's a topic that in Europe you don't often hear discussions about Southeast Asia, or almost at all, but if it comes up, this comes up. And people sort of take it almost as I wouldn't say for granted, in a sense that it will happen, but they take it for granted there's not that much deep discussion about it. So tell us, as a small country in Southeast Asia, Singapore, how do you look at the potential of another small country?
No, Kissinger has often said that in his negotiations with Zhou Enlai and with Mao Zedong, they always come back to Taiwan. So in the end, the breakthrough in relations was when the US recognized one China. It was fudged initially when Kissinger very cleverly came up with this phrase that Chinese on both sides of the straits recognize only one China. In 1979, when Carter established diplomatic relations with China, that one China is represented by Beijing. In fact, the idea of one China was first proclaimed in Cairo during the war, when Chiang Kai-shek attended together with Roosevelt and Churchill. And this was confirmed in Potsdam. So the legality of China's claim over Taiwan is internationally recognized. It's not in doubt. No one questions it. But America would, of course, want China to be divided forever if possible. But that's not going to happen because the correlation of forces is shifting. The Indo-Pacific Command, headquartered in Honolulu, they've done many exercises. In the Western Pacific, the US depends on the aircraft carriers for the projection of power. Today, Chinese hypersonic missiles, every one of those aircraft carriers are at risk. And Peter Hegseth, the defense secretary, before he became defense secretary, talked about it. So they had to be far away. But even Guam is within striking range. So the Americans will have to use cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. But China has many more of those missiles, or potentially can produce many more of those missiles. A nuclear exchange is too dangerous because China has enough warheads to effectively destroy American cities. Furthermore, if there's war over Taiwan, TSMC will be destroyed. If TSMC is destroyed, America will be deprived of its chips, Europe will be deprived of its chips. But China can carry on, maybe 70-80%, but China has quite a formidable chip-making capability, which is improving by the month. And China now has played its most important trump card, which is rare earths, to which the US has no response. Because without the magnets, you can't build F-35s, you can't have your bunker buster bombs. You have no defense industry. And the Chinese do not want to overplay that card, so they keep the US on a short leash where they supply every 6 months with end-user certificates. The US keeps China on a short leash on chip technology. So each has leashed the other. So I don't think there'll be war over Taiwan.
Thank you. So, by the way, now I would like to open also to questions. I have some further ones, but great. So I saw a lot of energy in that hand going up. So if you don't mind, we don't have another mic to go around. You can ask. I'll repeat then your question to everybody. Sorry, also present yourself. Just.
I'm Natalia, I'm from Ukraine, and I'm here for 3 days. Thank you to ArcelorMittal, give opportunity to us to study here. Thank you. And I want to thank you for sharing. And you told a very nice thing about the history, and that we should learn from history. But I think we do not. You told that we should speak to Russia and to Putin, but we all remember how it finished when Europe tried to speak to Putin, to Germany while the Second World War. And it finished crucially, and I think that nobody learned from that history. And as a participant of the events, I live close to the hostilities. And I feel every day the bombing and drones and attacks. And I can say that I can't see how we can speak nowadays to Russia without whole world supporting us with a force, because they do not understand the world and they do not want peace with us. They want to erase us and do not have such a nation agreements. That's why I'm trying to understand why the world doesn't understand and learn from history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cool. Did the back of the room hear the question? Yeah, okay, good. So then I won't repeat. So, George.
What is the question?
Why the world doesn't learn from the Second World War?
Well, let's play back to before 2022. If we can play back and start again, what would we have done? To 2010, to 2000, what would we have done? I have a great admiration for Chancellor Helmut Kohl because he achieved German unification. In 1994, I was a minister in attendance to him. So I had some quiet moments with him. I spoke through an interpreter. And he told me how he dealt with Gorbachev. They were on the phone all the time, and anything he needed, they would supply. And at that time, the West promised Russia that NATO will not expand eastwards. But NATO expanded eastwards relentlessly. And many Western strategic thinkers, including Kissinger and Cunning and many others, said Ukraine must be a buffer state. And many Europeans thought that way. But there were elements in America and maybe people in Europe who felt that Russia can never be small enough. So he kept pushing. I know how the resentment built up over Kosovo because I was sitting next to Lavrov. It was building up inside. No, Maidan, the Russians thought it was a coup by the Americans. It's more complicated than that. I was sitting next to Yanukovych before it happened. I was still a minister. I didn't know he's a poker player, and he's got a card-reading photographic memory. Then in the end, he had to run for his life. Before that, Kushma, through his foreign minister Horin, wanted a free trade agreement with Singapore. I said, what do you want a free trade agreement with Singapore? I said, we will have all the advantages. You will get nothing from us. We're already tariff-free. He said, no. We will benefit by an association with Singapore. I had long conversations with the Ukrainian ambassador in Singapore, Pavlo Sultansky. He said, my wife will cook you borscht. But he left before I could take up his invitation. When the war started, I called him up. He said he evacuated to Poland, often within earshot of machine gun fire. And since then, hundreds of thousands of people have died. So we play back. If we could start again, how would we have played it? Because if we don't conduct this exercise, we will never be able to achieve peace. Because there's so much hatred, so much anger, so much pain, so much sorrow. How do you overcome this? The Ukrainian ambassador kept on telling me that Russia will collapse internally. I said, you cannot be sure about that. And you've got to work with a Russia that will be around. And without Western power supporting you, you're at risk. And Western power is contingent upon their own domestic politics. And now we have Trump, who decided that he will no longer be leading but be a mediator. So this is a new reality. If I'm Ukrainian, I'll be very angry. But what can I do? So Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, I knew him when I was foreign minister. He plays golf with Trump, so Trump invited him to the White House. And he talked about 1944, when Finland achieved peace by giving up territory. And the word Finlandization came from 1944, where you will be neutral, like Austria is neutral. Now Finland has joined NATO, so Medvedev is very angry. But I thought for Stubb to make that remark in Washington, given the current mood in Europe, was very brave. So I dropped him a message. I said, it was a courageous statement that you made. But I think he was being hard-headed, In the end, these are the cards. How do you play? Whatever the pain, the sorrow, that's happened. To achieve peace, what shape would that peace take? There could be a ceasefire in the next 1-2 years, but I don't believe there'll be peace for decades to come. In the same way as there's no peace in Cyprus, there's no peace agreement in Kashmir, there's no peace agreement in the Korean Peninsula. And for the poison to be extracted from the soil, so that people can look at one another as fellow human beings, that will take a long time. That's my response. And I'm very pained listening to you, as I'm very pained when I communicate with the former ambassador to Singapore. But I keep on thinking back, could it have been avoided? I think it could have been avoided.
Thank you for the question. So, thank you, George. I would like to give a question to our Dean, Patrick Van Hout here. Patrick, you're here, so I'll give you the mic. Chin.
Mr. Joe, nice to meet you. Glad to have you here. I'm a macroeconomist by training, and so my question is also going to be in that direction. Singapore has a trade deficit with the US, but still Singapore was slammed by a 10% tariff by Mr. Trump. Singapore chose to remain silent and to not retaliate, to do nothing. And my question is that a successful strategy looking backward? Is it paying off? What can Europe learn from that? And what do you expect, or by when do you expect that it's going to be beneficial for the Singaporeans?
We take a very different view of trade flows. When I was trade minister, I didn't care whether we had a surplus or deficit, because so long as there's movement, there's money to be made. And Singapore, remember, at the heart of the Singapore economy is arbitrage. If the world were in equilibrium, we have no business. But there's no danger of the world being in equilibrium. It's always in disequilibrium. And sometimes in conflict, there are more opportunities, because barriers will be established, the possibilities for arbitrage will grow. But if the arbitrage is too slim, we're out. It's just not worth it. Remember, we must always be a place where you can buy cheaper and sell dearer, where you can get to a destination faster by going through Singapore than if you fly direct, where you can process your data more efficiently through Singapore than through any other way in the region. That's how we make a living. But of course, others will want to compete with us. So the margin will shrink. And if it shrinks beneath to a certain level, we're out. So there must be no emotional commitment to any product or service. That's the mind of an arbitrager. And it cannot be emotional. It cannot say, oh, I've been in this business, my father has been in this business, I want to remain in this business. Well, we can't afford that. That's a luxury. So that's Singapore's approach. And in some ways, but you're in the EU, that should be Luxembourg's approach. In other words, you have France, you have Germany, you have other big powers. They do certain things, some are clever, some are not so clever. So you think through and say, okay, there's a new niche for myself, because they have decided to be emotional. So I will enter that niche. And that's how we approach it in Singapore.
Thank you. Okay, Vijay.
Thank you, Marin. So my name is Vijay Goel, and I work with ArcelorMittal. Among other responsibilities, I have also responsibility for Ukraine, and I'm very proud of my team in Ukraine. what they are doing is absolutely wonderful, to stand up for their honor and right. And I said they do miracles in the situation they are. But my question to you, first of all, I'm mesmerized by your whole speech. It's amazing. But my question to you, who have lived your life in politics and have met all these great politicians all over the world, what do you see as a purpose of politics and geopolitics? That's my first question. And I say this with some context, that what I see now is mud wrestling that's going on.
Is what?
Mud wrestling.
Mud wrestling. Oh.
It's open. It's only with or sometimes without underwear, sorry. It's all in open now, okay? Leveraging power, making it a business equation or a model. I have this power, you have this power. I have chips, you depend on my rare earth, but you depend on my chips, and so on and so forth. It's going on and on and on, leveraging of power. Was it always like that? Or do you think it's become completely naked now and become completely in open? This is my first part of the question. My second part of the question is that given the Gini index, or the difference in rich and poor, is growing as time is passing, on one hand. On the other hand, there is AI coming in, risk of singularity or AGI. There is change in the whole geopolitics, as you said, also multipolar dimensions are coming in. What is your hypothesis for a common man who wants peace and happiness? What is your hypothesis? Where are we heading to? Two questions. Thank you.
If we're a student of history, then we'll be pessimistic about how human beings treat one another. And every time there's a new technology, we use it to kill each other. Until the slaughter is so bad, we begin to restrain ourselves. And this will happen with AI. The Israelis are using AI to decapitate leadership. It's scary. You listen to Alex Karp from Palantir. He celebrates it because this is clever, you see. But in the end, where does it lead to? Because you can remove the tip of an iceberg. A new tip will pop up. You can remove it again. For as long as the iceberg is there, there'll be a tip. Maybe not as sharp, maybe not as structured, but there'll be a tip. And eventually you'll be sharpened and structured. Can you get rid of the iceberg? You can try. But always remember that by 2050, 25% of the world's population will be African. 40% of babies will be African. And 50% of babies in the world will be Muslim. So these are the icebergs we're talking about in demographics. So how do we deal with each other as human beings? For a brief period, this collection of atoms become you, becomes me. And then we return to dust. During this period, have we added or subtracted? If we see life as being zero-sum, for me to take from you so that I enjoy life more, I'm not sure you enjoy life more because you will die unhappy. The greatest fulfillment in life is that during that brief period, when that collection of atoms become us, as an individual, we add something to the entire field. In other words, blessed are the peacemakers because they try to achieve win-win outcomes. Of course, when we are in business, when we are in politics, we've got to work through all the game theory quadrants, I was helping Pope Francis for 7 years. usually after a meeting with the cardinals, we will have lunch somewhere in Rome. We were on a budget, so it was a cheap lunch, but in Italy, you always get good food. Even the cheap wines are very serviceable. So we had a secretary who was a world expert in medieval canon law, a Scotsman. Had a wonderful way of the English language, wrote beautiful notes and minutes. So one night he told me, you know, George, he's very cunning, you know. I said, who? He said, the Pope. Oh. He said, he's unbelievably cunning. I was not surprised, because how can you be a Pope in Italy if you're not cunning? I mean, he may be of Italian descent, but Italy is a complex environment. So I was not too concerned. I thought, it's okay, he'll be effective. A few years later, after another such dinner, he said, you know, George, this man is holy. He's really holy. You know, normally when you know a person, initially you may be impressed. After a while, you have a more jaded view of that person. You become a bit more cynical. A person who appeared very black turned out to be gray. A person who appeared white also turns out to be gray. But it's rare that his view became whiter, you know. From being very cunning, he said he was unbelievably holy. So to be effective wherever we are, whether it is in a family or in a company or in government, if we don't understand Machiavelli, we cannot be effective. Because that is an important part of human behavior. But if we are not also holy, we will lose our mission and our life will become meaningless. It is a bundle. If you read The Chinese Art of War, it begins by saying that to govern a country, you cannot not know about warfare, because then you're being naive. So you have to be cunning. You have to understand the ways of the world. But it says the first factor is to understand the moral way. In other words, if what you do is not in accord with the times and does not lead to a better humanity, then in the end, you will come to grief. And therefore, the greatest victory is when you can achieve your objective without fighting. You see? The Chinese put on a parade. They show off their missiles, the drones, the tanks, and so on. I think their purpose is to tell the Americans, let's not fight. Then they would have achieved their purpose. Because if the objective is to fight, you end up with a Ukraine, with a Gaza. It's not only zero-sum, it'll be negative-sum. So I would say, wherever we are, without that moral compass, which makes us holy, but without at the same time having that understanding of the ways of the world, we cannot be effective.
So, I would like to thank you for this answer, and I believe it answers the question. Also because I think one of my questions was going to be, what can business students learn directly, something applicable to their lives, to their business, but I think this answered very well, right? Next question. Please stand up, present yourself. And speak up a lot, yeah.
Good evening, Mr. George. Thank you for giving such a wonderful insight. My name is Neha Verma. I'm a student of LSB. I just wanted to get an insight. Israel bombed Qatar. And in June, Iran bombed US military base in Qatar. So speaking of small countries, Qatar being such a strong economical country with great GDP, so much oil and gas, what is your take that why hasn't Qatar retaliated or allowed the battle to be fought on its soil? And is it an influence of American imperialism? What would be your take on that? Thank you.
I think the circumstances of Israel's attempt at decapitating the Hamas leadership in Qatar are still unclear. Remember, it was the Americans who asked the Qataris to allow Hamas to open an office there so that there is a point of coordination when you want to talk peace and negotiate. So was America really uninvolved in this strike? I don't know. Trump denies it. But Trump may not know everything. You remember when the daughter of the founder of Huawei was arrested in Vancouver. At that same time, Xi Jinping was hosted by Trump in Mar-a-Lago. Trump was not informed beforehand. So I don't know if Trump was informed, because there are many, the US is a big government, there are many departments and some are involved in secret operations. But in Qatar, it's a huge airbase called El Udeid, which is the most important American facility in the entire Middle East. It's bristling with air defense systems and radars and so on. So for the Israelis to be able to fly close to Qatar and let off those missiles without being detected, it's hard to believe. Did the Qatari government know? Probably they didn't know, because the Qataris... Are you from Qatar?
No, I used to work there before.
Okay, they are very proud people. I had dealings with them before. In 2001, after September 11, the Americans wanted to shift the WTO meeting from Doha to Singapore. So one night, the Americans called me up at home to ask if Singapore can host the WTO meeting, which was only a month away. WTO meeting, hundreds of ministers, security nightmare. I said I have to discuss this with my Prime Minister. So my Prime Minister and Lee Kuan Yew said, the new round is important and we should be helpful. But we will not host. Qatar will host. We will provide the facilities, tables and chairs and security, but it will be attenuated. In other words, the delegations will have to be smaller. Then the Americans put pressure on the Qataris to agree. They were angry with the Americans and they were very angry with Singapore for even agreeing to the possibility of Singapore hosting the WTO meeting. The meeting did not shift. When I went to Qatar, the minister greeted me with an iciness which left me frigid, But I was very helpful to him. In the end, we launched a round. And by the end of the meetings, we became very good friends. And they said, come visit me later. Which I did 2 years later. And the emir gave me a 4-hour lunch. My meetings had to be cancelled because he would not end the lunch. I was wondering, what the hell is happening? And I couldn't just say, thank you, Your Highness, bye-bye. So I sat through it, wondering what was happening. And as we left, he said, do you know what happened? I said, what? No, about the WTO meeting. He said, I called up Cheney. The emir called up Cheney and told Cheney, if Qatar were not safe enough to host a WTO meeting, how can it be safe enough to host a US airbase? Cheney called up the US representative and told him, you go to Doha. And during the negotiations, the Indian Commerce Minister, Murali Maran, was very difficult because in India, you misplay trade, especially in agriculture, you lose an election. The Qataris threatened him that if you don't come on board, I will be expelled. So when this attack took place, my mind went back to the Qataris and my dealings with them. They are spunky people. When the Saudis and Emiratis wanted to blockade them, who saved them? The Iranians and the Turks. They remember this. They remember their friends. They also remember their enemies. So I think there'll be consequences. What the Israelis have done is very foolish, because if you kill your negotiators, who will negotiate with you? So in the end, you'll be left just to force. And one day, the Americans will not be as powerful as they are today in relative terms, and younger Americans are turning against Israel. The correlation of forces will change. And if you do not make use of this period when you have a strong position to negotiate a good long-term position, when the time comes, it will be much harder. So to me, it's like a Greek tragedy. The audience sees it coming, but the people on stage can't.
Thank you. We have a question here. Wait, take the mic.
Thanks. Hello, Mr. Yu. Thank you for your amazing speech. I'm Winston Mzwe from Côte d'Ivoire, West Africa. And here I'm a full-time MBA student at LSB. And I wanted to really thank you for the speech. And also, during your speech, you emphasized that solutions are only possible when we try to understand perspective, fears, and motivation of others. In West Africa, we have an regional organization that calls ECOWAS, and who often mediate conflicts with neighboring countries. Our external powers have competing interests, like what we saw in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Rwanda. And from your experience in Singapore and with Asian, how can regional organization can foster dialogue and understanding to prevent dehumanization and conflict and to pursue a win-win collaboration? That's my question.
You're from Côte d'Ivoire, so you would know Obasanjo, who, when he was president of Nigeria, he relinquished power voluntarily, and he became a very well-regarded senior African leader. He was a good friend of Lee Kuan Yew, and he wanted Lee Kuan Yew to visit Africa. Lee Kuan Yew visited Africa in the 60s. He was not optimistic for Africa, so he didn't want to go to Africa. So he told Obasanjo, he said, why don't you bring your friends and come to Singapore instead? And Lee Kuan Yew asked me to organize a meeting, so I got to meet Obasanjo. And to like him and to respect him. Last year, Obasanjo, in a speech in Addis Ababa, he's now quite senior in years. He said, let us be realistic in Africa, that Western institutions do not work. What did he mean by that? That if all you do is count votes, but the primary loyalty is to your tribe, then politics is just a game to be played on how the pie should be divided among the different tribes. It becomes a game to collect rent. So you have democracy, then you have corruption, then you have unrest, then the army comes in. And the army becomes corrupt. And then you throw out the army. Then you have elections again. Then you go round and round. It is not a debate between autarky and democracy. You've got to work a system which is in accord with the nature of African society, which is different in different parts of Africa. So in Ethiopia, under up to Zewi Menalis, they had a coalition. So tribal disputes were resolved centrally, and then a common policy applied to the entire country. That broke down. The Tigrayans became disaffected, and you have a festering wound, and now even the Amharas and others are not happy. In South Africa, what held them together was the ANC. But again, that is corroding. The new hero is Traore, right? Young man, he's always in his military garb. I don't know how long he will last, but is one of the young military leaders who threw the French out of Africa, West Africa, because the French were neo-colonialists. When Gaddafi was in Libya, he fed everybody, right? So you kept the peace. The Tuaregs were all feeding from him. You kept the peace in the entire Sahel. So you removed Gaddafi, things broke down, and now there's no equilibrium. So Africa must somehow, each region must find its own way to the future based on its own nature, which is tribal division and to some extent, religious division. The Americans separated South Sudan because it's Christian from the rest of Sudan. It's not brought peace either to the south or to the north because you have not addressed the fundamental problem, which is tribal affiliation. The army can hold the ring, but you need a political group which, at the elite level, which unites the tribes and agree on a common policy. In effect, it will be like a communist party, but you can't call it a communist party. It has to be African. So to me, African political development is still in a period of fermentation. But what is clear is the model cannot be Western, it cannot be Chinese, it cannot be Indian, it has to be African. And we have to vary from region to region.
Thank you, George. Have a seat. So, Arko, so one question, and then we have, after your question, last two questions, okay? So.
Thank you so much for this great insights. I'm a student here. My name is Arko. I just wanted to ask
Where
about...
are you from?
I'm from India, originally. I just wanted to ask about Myanmar, because given this year, it has been a tumultuous year for all ASEAN countries, but Myanmar has been a bit of a riddle for almost all ASEAN countries. And as the year unfolded, we saw quite a lot of surprises. Mr. Trump has normalized relationship with the junta, or seeming to approach that goal. There seems to be a dual-track diplomacy going on with India engaging the Arakan army and the junta parallelly, and the Chinese also engaging the TNNA and the MNDAA, forcing them to give up some territory to the junta. And ASEAN staying away still from inviting Min Aung Hlaing. So in light of all these developments, and in your experience dealing with Myanmar and the greater ASEAN dynamics, what would be your advice as the upcoming summits are coming up, the ASEAN summit is coming up, what would be your advice to the ASEAN body and to, let's say, Mr. Balakrishnan on how to proceed with Myanmar with all these very contradictory aspects going on in the country?
No, because it's very bright. Okay. The reason why I'm staying on the side is because
it's too much light.
The light is blinding and I can't see the audience. Sorry. Yeah. And I don't be turning away from you. No, Myanmar will remain a festering sore. You'll be at a certain level of homeostasis. There'll be no peace, no war. No one wants a country to be divided, but no one wants too strong a central authority. The army which created modern Myanmar is part of the problem, but we have to be part of the solution. In the end, it will have to be a confederal polity, where different regions have their own armies, they'll trade with one another, they'll fight each other from time to time, and the neighboring countries will find their own solutions where it matters to them. So China has close links with all the ethnic groups on their border, India with hers, Thailand with hers. There'll be no unitary state for a long time. But that's okay, because they don't really want the country to dissolve into civil war. And none of the neighboring countries want that to happen either. So I don't think Myanmar, the problem there, will get too bad. We are affected. We don't like it. It's an infection, but it's a low-grade continuing infection which should remain like that for a very long time. We'll apply some salve, we'll give some antibiotics, and maybe the wound will improve a little bit, but it's a chronic condition. That's Myanmar. I don't think you should be too concerned that Myanmar will somehow upset the equilibrium in Southeast Asia or between Southeast Asia and China or Southeast Asia and India. What I'm not comfortable with is the Americans don't want the Belt and Road to succeed. And the Chinese want to bypass the Straits of Malacca by having a port in South Pew. But they've got to go through Arakan State. The Chinese have a vested interest in peace, but the Americans don't mind trouble because that will disrupt the Belt and Road. In the same way as they don't mind Baluchistan upsetting China's road to Gwadar Port. But in the end, I think it's for the local people to decide between peace and war. And China, in its own interest, will be on the side of peace. But distant powers, looking at it and not paying the price themselves, may not be as supportive of peace as those who live next door, like India and China.
Thank you. Actually, if you don't mind, I will actually take the opportunity to ask the last question. So sorry for those of you that were raising the hands. My last question is about probably the man that is probably the most Googled man on the planet, and a man that everybody has an opinion on, which is the American president, right? Now, I want to just say, obviously in Europe, in the US, we have a different political tradition, different political culture, and to be honest, different political philosophy than in Asia. So from your perspective, and I'm not saying from China's, I'm saying from perspective of Singapore and everything you've done in your life, how do you read the current American president?
The reason why I stand up is because I want to be able to see all of you and for you to see me. Trump is an agent of history. In fact, he's fast-forwarding the future. He's the first American president to take a realistic view of the limits of American power. So he wants to disengage from different parts of the world. And he doesn't say it, but if you watch him, he's trying to consolidate around North America, to include Greenland, to include the entire Caribbean, which is why he wants the Gulf of Mexico renamed as the Gulf of America. And if he can, to bring Colombia and Venezuela under his heel. So that will be his hemisphere. Brazil, he cannot. He knows that. And if he can achieve that, in terms of the command of resources, America will remain very powerful. The budget deficit has got to be addressed one way or another. Without the US dollar enjoying its exorbitant privilege, that budget deficit cannot be sustained. One day, Americans will have to decide how 700 to 800 military bases all over the world, including many in Europe, are to be financed. Trump says, Germany, Poland, you pay. But America still pays a lot. But if you can print the dollar, that's okay. But one day, you can't print the dollar. Then it's a choice between guns and butter. In the choice between guns and butter, it's quite obvious how voters will vote. Then the bases will have to be shut down, one after another. And once bases are shut down, in every region where bases are shut down, a new equilibrium will have to emerge. So Trump is fast-forwarding the future and accelerating the crystallization of a multipolar world. So ignore his antics, but look at him as an agent of change, like a Shiva destroying in order so that the future can be born. And all of us who look 10 years ahead, trying to predict Trump is very difficult. Trying to predict what will happen in Myanmar or Ukraine, or you can take a bet. But 10 years from now, the direction, I think that is clear. And Trump is hastening us in that direction. That's how I view Trump.
Thank you. So nobody would like to stay here for another 5 hours more than me. It's incredibly interesting. It almost feels like you've come all this way just to talk to us for so brief a period. But everything good has a beginning and an end. And today we'll stop here. I want to thank everybody really for coming here tonight, taking your time to hopefully listen to something new and get some new insights. George, I want to thank you. I hope you enjoyed your trip to Luxembourg. I'm pretty sure you did. It was quite good. I think you also had tremendous hospitality, especially today. George spent some time with the Prime Minister and also with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I think some very interesting discussions arose out of that. Without further ado, we will keep you informed on future similar events. A couple of months ago, we had an event about defense investment in Europe. Today, we have a perspective that is quite unique, that I think Europeans are not really exposed to. So thank you for that. Thank you all for coming. See you in class. For those of you that are students, welcome. Not welcome, but thank you for coming, and see you again very soon. That was a weird...